Děkuji Vladimíru Špidlovi a nyní můžeme už přejít k hlavnímu vystoupení dnešního odpoledne a večera. Rád bych k řečnickému pultíku pozval Paula Masona. Paul Mason působí v současné době jako nezávislý novinář, působí také jako hostující profesor na univerzitě Wolverhampton a můžete ho také znát z řady jeho knih, například posledního bestselleru Populism Guide to Our Future. Mě bych ho ještě poprosil, jestli může...
Well, Prime Minister, Excellencies, and fellow Europeans, thank you for inviting me. If you are not depressed, you might be by the end of this talk, but I hope to bring some solutions as well. I am from a town called Leigh, near Manchester. It's one of the first industrial towns in the world. The first factory was built around about the year 1800. The first strike took place around about the year 1818. And for about 100 years after that, the working class people of that town voted Liberal. There was no social democracy. They had trade unions. But in 1922, they voted for the Labour Party, a party of which I am a member, the British Social Democratic Party. And from that day, 1922, until now, every election in my town was won by Labour. But in 2010, the fascist party, the British National Party, got 2,000 votes out of 50,000 votes. And people thought, okay, what's happening? In 2015, the far-right xenophobic party UKIP, United Kingdom Independence Party, took those 2,000 fascist votes and added to them 8,000 votes from quite ordinary working class people and got 10,000, so 20% of the electorate, no votes for extreme xenophobic right-wing politics. And in the Brexit referendum, this town voted 2/3 to leave Europe. In 2016, we also had a local election for the council that runs the town. In half of all the sub-districts, which in England are called wards, in half of these sub-districts, UKIP came second to Labour. I didn't even need to look on a map to know which wards they were. Just ask, where did the coal mine used to be? Where did the factory used to be? It's not just the deprivation that drove that swing to the right. In other words, it is places that only had community and cohesion and small-scale networks left. And something has happened that turns what was once a source of our strength as working people into a source of very worrying weakness and xenophobia. I hope you are aware of the famous elephant graph drawn by the World Bank economist Branko Milanovic, which describes the benign impact of neoliberalism and globalization on the developing world, but then down here, in the neck of the elephant, there are people in Britain, in America, in France, who gained nothing from 30 years of globalization, and some less than nothing. Well, the streets I am talking about are right down in the neck of the elephant. Now, Labour, I hope, will still win this town I come from in 7 weeks' time in our emergency general election. But it will do so from a core, voting core, of teachers, nurses, people with university degrees, skilled people who work in multinational companies, people who work in companies where to say what UKIP says, to say what the AfD says in public would be to be sacked from that company because it is not allowed to be racist. Those people are the core of our vote. Unfortunately, Families like the one I come from, coal miners and cotton spinners for generations, are now, some of them, the core vote of the far right. And in fact, the manual, low-skilled working class is now the battleground for this discussion between social democracy, liberalism, and right-wing nationalism. In other words, those of you who knew what Tony Blair did for British Labour, which was to use the working class as a voting base and to attract in centrist voters from the middle class, this situation is now reversed for us. 200,000 people have joined Labour in a year, but they are mainly from the professional, urban salariat, the educated part of the population. And so I have to go back, and as a journalist, we at least have to deal with honesty and plain speaking. We don't have to, as the politicians do, we don't have to moderate our language. And in this spirit, I will say, I have to contemplate the possibility that this 200-year story of the move from liberalism to social democracy could end with a move towards the right. Draw the arc of history for my town, and it could end very badly. Now, what's happening to British Labour is, of course, partly driven by specifics. I won't bore you with the specifics because the universals are more interesting. The main problem is the one faced by all of us in European social democracy and the radical left. And it is that the working class culture that was our strength has been stripped of its relationship to work. It is now being defined more purely around language, religion, and ethnicity, what you might call face and place. Clinging to that identity was deemed illogical by those who promoted neoliberalism. Tony Blair made a famous speech basically saying to people from my town, you will only survive if you forget all this stuff about your past and your identity. But now, neoliberalism, I will argue, has failed. And globalization, which never really delivered much to the people like that, has become seen as the cause of all the problems. Now, the massive and sudden migration into such fragile communities of people from the rest of the European Union, be in no doubt that is what caused Brexit. I've spent enough time with a microphone in my hand, put the microphone out, what's the problem? Migration. Don't let anybody tell you it's about anything other than that. But it's not necessarily about racism, nationalism, and xenophobia. Because the migrant communities who live among us in Britain, 3 million EU citizens, are decent, hard-working people. They are mainly white. They are mainly Christian. And their beer and their sausage tastes much, much the same as our beer and our sausage. So where did all the hostility come from? What happened? I think it rose because, rightly or wrongly, those communities came to symbolize to British people the abstract form of citizenship that got built in to the current phase of the European Union's model. See, neoliberalism, as an economic philosophy, says to people in my town, we don't care where you come from. It doesn't matter that your grandfather worked in this factory or your grandmother in this other factory. It doesn't matter to us, the incoming global multinational, which is opening a call center or a warehouse, that you are your grandfather's grandson. Because if somebody from Prague or Warsaw will work for the same or less money and is much better educated than you, because that's the likelihood, they will go to the front of the queue. By the way, the only redistribution still available to you as a citizen of Britain, because Thatcher killed half of the redistribution mechanisms, the only redistribution mechanism you have is free access to healthcare and education. But you know what? So does the guy now from Prague and Warsaw. Think about how that went down. The mistake we made as a political class was not to hear when people complained about it quietly. We said, oh, yes, of course. There's no alternative anyway. So what's the problem? Brexit was the loud shout of anger, often unjustified, but we have to recognize that at its core was this problem about who you are. If you define citizenship as economic and base the idea of citizenship around that key figure in neoliberal ideology, homo economicus, economic man, and not around the real breathing people who actually live in these towns, whether it is in the Loire Valley in France, whether it is in Manchester, where I am from, whether it is in Pomerania in Germany. If you don't base citizenship around reality, you send an unfortunate message. And I know nobody in the European Union wanted to send this message, but this is the message they sent. You can reassert your identity as a citizen, fully rounded, 360-degree person with an identity and a history, if you break the global system. Now, when the global system worked, that was a massive risk, too big a risk to take. People who said it were laughed at, thrown out, even of the communities that now are voting Brexit. But once the global system failed, it becomes a risk worth contemplating. And this creates a massive danger. I don't want to restrain myself in any way. I want to say to you, there is a massive danger facing to us. And I think your Prime Minister acknowledged that. Though the overall Brexit vote was driven by middle-class, conservative and elderly voters, in a town like the one I'm describing, there are not many middle-class people. It was driven by working-class people, and it was seen as a revolt of the working class against the elite. And not just the white working class. I reject the idea that a white working class exists in Britain. It is always multi-ethnic. Around 18% of black people voted for Brexit, 18%. And 23% of Asian people voted for Brexit. Who are they? The taxi driver, the security guard, the low-paid factory worker. They feel as threatened by what Europe became as the classic xenophobic, white, racist person. But they're all about to find that they are wrong. They are all about to find that Brexit will be an economic catastrophe for them, even if not for people like Boris Johnson. It is going to be a catastrophe for them. And it was a fake revolt, stirred up by people like Johnson, stirred up by people like UKIP, who now quite happily walk away. The UKIP guy, Farage, isn't standing in this election, nor is the millionaire who funded UKIP, Aaron Banks, doesn't even want to take responsibility. But the result's going to be, instead of the people taking control, the rich will take control of post-Brexit Britain. Hard-right conservative leadership will lead back to Thatcherism. Now, in this situation, the most likely outcome is a hard and chaotic Brexit process for my country. I fear trucks will line up at Dover, borders will be erected, not just between Britain and the Irish Republic, where the border has been progressively abolished, but between England and Scotland. Because I think it is likely that Scotland will vote to leave the United Kingdom, and then maybe for some people this is a great thing, but for others not. That's the end of Britain as an economic possibility. And people like me now have to wake up every day and consider that as a real possibility and not a fantasy. And here's the worst thing, and it's the same problem we have as in America. Trump will fail. Trump will not deliver on a single promise to the American working poor, and neither can Brexit. But then, what comes next? This is the context of the challenge to social democracy to move beyond the situation, to come up with answers, concrete answers, but also ideological answers and philosophical answers that can inform what Europe does next. I hope the British story will still be part of what Europe does next, but even that hangs in the balance. What can we do? First thing we need to do is to recognize the source of the problem. It's the failure of a global economic model that we on the left call neoliberalism. For 15 years, it promoted growth. It produced the elephant graph. That's good for Kenya, not good for Lee, where I come from. In Britain, wages stagnated, social mobility slowed down, and then the financial system collapsed. And for the last 7 years, we've been running global capitalism with central bank money. Now, Mark Carney, the Bank of England governor, said, I think perceptively last year, you can do this for a long time. You can keep a failing economic model alive if you can go on printing $12 trillion worth of money from the central banks across the world. You can keep it, in other words, on life support for years if you want to. But the problem is, you can't keep an ideology on life support. The human brain demands logic. People demand answers to, how does this system work? How come the state has to prop up the banks? How come the state has to go on printing money, but then when they print it, the rich people get rich, but my wages stagnate? How come? How does that work? What does it mean for my child, my grandchild? That they can't afford to live in a single-room apartment in their own town? How does that work? So it shouldn't be of any surprise to you that large numbers of people have begun to reject a system for which there is no explanation. There is no coherent logic. Now, I said in a book I wrote, published in 2015, called Post-Capitalism, that we have a choice. I want to put it really starkly to you, as I did then, to ditch neoliberalism and save globalization. But since I wrote that, we've seen Brexit, we've seen Trump, we've seen the rise of right-wing nationalism and authoritarianism in Hungary and Turkey, and we're seeing the rise to a partial extent in Poland, I would argue. It was brilliant to see Guy Verhofstadt in the European Parliament, I think just now, it's absolutely, as we call it in English, lashed Viktor Orban with his tongue, saying to him, the Eurosceptics are more honest than you. They say, we don't like Europe, we want to leave. You say, we don't like Europe, but please give us the European funding. That was great to see, but it's taken years for the centrists and the elite politicians to stand up to this. And I think we have to go do it, because we are one slip, one mistake away from a far-right president of France. I hope and I think it will not happen, but anything can happen, as you know. So I don't think globalization is going to be saved in its current form. I think we have to start understanding this. Whatever we do in Europe, America has turned towards economic nationalism. And not just to that, towards great power diplomacy. And Putin and Trump are quite happy to play the game in which economic systems come into play alongside geopolitical diplomacy. I put sanctions on you, I take sanctions away from you, you invest in my country, I invest in your oil industry. We give you this sphere of influence in the Middle East, you take that sphere of influence in the Middle East. It's a completely different world to the multilateral world every one of you has probably lived their adult life in. And I can't see a way of stopping it, but I can see a way of Europe surviving it, and indeed becoming one of the best places to be in the world as this happens. So we need to rethink what social democracy has to be, and this is what I'm going to focus on for just the latter part of the speech. I am an independent journalist. I don't work for the British Labour Party. I support it. I try to influence its leadership, and I support its leadership. Jeremy Corbyn, I supported him not because I agree with everything he says. In fact, I disagree with quite a lot. But at the time I had to choose inside Labour, he was the only one prepared to say, we need to make a break with free market economics. For the same reason, I admire what Tsipras did in Greece. I admire what Tsipras is doing in Greece. I think he has been right to stay in power and try and mitigate the impact of the austerity demanded by Europe. And I admire what Sanders did in the USA. If you look at the actions of the people I'm talking about, Corbyn, Tsipras, Sanders, they are painted as radicals. In fact, in my country, the current attack on Corbyn is that he is a threat to national security. He is being treated as if he was the political wing of a terrorist group by some right-wing politicians. But actually, all they want is left social democracy. Everything they actually do falls within very, very familiar politics to those of us who are old enough to remember the Keynesian era. So what do? We should reverse austerity. This is easier to do in countries outside the Eurozone, where I would argue the German political elite is gaming the Eurozone system to force the periphery to pay the price for the whole system's failure. For Labour in Britain, however, reversing austerity has to be done in a prioritised way. Labour's yet to reveal its full manifesto for this coming election, but I hope that it will put public investment first, leveraging in the private sector to these poor left-behind towns. Then funding the provision of universal services from taxation, and thirdly, restoring the welfare system. It has to be done in prioritised order. Now, I think British Labour must be on the point of breaking one of the big taboos of modern centrist politics, because in order to fund the level of spending commitment it wants to make to these towns where we have to defeat the right, it's going to have to tax the wealthy. And that's been a taboo since Tony Blair, since Schroeder. The argument is you do what you can within the deal offered at the core of the free market model. I don't think we can any longer. And when we do what I hope we will do, which is to tax assets, not just the incomes of the rich, it will feel like an assault on the elite. The newspapers will go crazy against Corbyn when he actually reveals the manifesto pledges that I hope he will pledge. But I say good, because I want people to wake up from the mesmeric dream that is surrounding them in places like where I come from, this mesmerizing dream of national greatness. We will make country X great again is the slogan every right-wing politician will sell to their own people, oblivious of the fact that if every country becomes great again, then all are effectively equal again. It's just a piece of illiteracy, but to snap people out of it, we need something big. And I hope that our party, Labour, which now has 500,000 members, can do that. We can't, our members are now drawn from the urban salariat, the educated and networked young, and from those who survived, whose principles and philosophies learned in the Keynesian era survived the defeats and reversals of the 1980s. That's who we are in Labour. We can't give an inch, not 1 inch, to xenophobia, not 1 inch to hostility to migrants, to Muslims, not 1 inch to anti-gay politics, not 1 inch to anti-feminism. And so there is a lot, our political class now has to, they were trained to be nice to people. They were trained to try and split the difference, to find the middle way. And for about 2 years now, Labour and Liberal politicians have had to sit on panels where the audience is shouting at them, get rid of the migrants. No, no, no. We can't give an inch to that. But what we can do is to arrive, like the spaceship in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, in these places with a basket full of money. And we have to do it. We have to find it and say, okay, here is a new library to replace the others that were closed under austerity. Here is more hospital beds to replace the ones that have been removed by austerity. Here is a new school. Here is a railway. Here is the infrastructure and the housing you desperately need. And at that point, we're going to have to ask them, a really obvious question. Do you want this, or do you want Brexit? Do you want this, or do you want racism and xenophobia? Because you can't eat racism. It doesn't put food on the table. In the old imperialist system, it did. You know, white workers from Britain and Germany and America were complicit in the conquest of third world countries. But in the new system, you can't eat racism. It is of no economic benefit to you whatsoever, and therefore we will offer you a choice. Now, it is in that spirit of offering a radical choice, I'll just finish by saying something about the European Union. Actually, the worst thing for somebody like me, who was campaigned for remaining in Europe, was prepared to see a Norwegian-style deal if we couldn't remain in Europe. The worst thing is, and you will find it if it happens to you, some of these things become easier to do outside Europe. That's the worst thing. We have a huge steelworks in South Wales, Port Talbot, which is constantly under threat of closure. It will be a massive, significant and symbolic event if this place closes. To us as British people, we lose the last vestiges of our heavy industry. The fault for failing to save it was, I think, combined. The European Commission never lifted a finger, but nor did our own government. They would all been happy to see it go. Who is waiting in the side streets of this town to tell people it's all the foreigners' fault, UKIP and the fascists? But saving Port Talbot might be easier when we're outside Europe. Economically, it'll be under greater threat. Politically, it'll be easier to save. So if you want to avoid economic nationalism, we're all used to the debate, less Europe, more Europe. I think we have to ask ourselves, less globalization, more sustainable globalization, more socially just globalization. I think, remember, Brexit was only won by 4 percentage points, 52 to 48. If I could rerun the last 20 years to avoid it, I would have made the accession process harder for some East European countries. And the mistake around migration was Blair's mistake. Not only to open the door immediately when other countries slowed East European migration down in order to build our capacity to deal with it, but to tell people only 30,000 people will come. That's what Blair said. 3 million are there now. Now, Labour, and not only Labour, all the progressive parties in Britain are absolutely clear. Be aware of this. We would, if we win the election, offer tomorrow unconditional rights to stay for all those 3 million people. That is a big thing to offer. It's not nothing. It's a unilateral offer. The Conservatives will do the opposite. They want to use your citizens, the citizens of Poland and Lithuania, as a bargaining chip. We will never, ever do that. But we might not win. And, we are struggling against a right-wing xenophobic mood. And not just that, I'll finish on this. Here's the real danger, and I think you need to be aware of it in Central and Eastern Europe, and also in Germany and France. As soon as Brexit happened, perfectly centrist conservative politicians flipped within weeks to being in favour of it. They didn't know they wanted it, and then they realised it was quite good for them. Because suddenly, it's the classic thing, suddenly all enemies are external. Anybody who opposes you, as we are opposing the terms of the Brexit proposal of Theresa May, we are now saboteurs. We are being treated, the right-wing newspapers are calling not just Labour, but the Liberal Democrats and the Scottish Nationalists, who are a left-wing nationalist party, saboteurs. I hope it doesn't happen to you, but if it does, I would expect to see some of the centrist, centre-right parties of Europe flip in the same direction that the Tories had. And then Europe's over. So it cannot be stressed too greatly. Bold action now. Bold action against President Erdogan. Bold action against Viktor Orban. Bold action against everybody who breaks the rules, which Verhofstadt did in the European Parliament, is good. It will help us, it will help you. Thank you.